I'm really pleased to be joining you today. I'm coming to you from Prince Edward Island off the east coast of Canada. So today I'm going to be talking about a study. This is my doctoral work, and it's an initial study. Things in Canada are in the beginning phases of considering the conversation around out-of-field teaching. So I'm focusing on teachers' experiences and their suggestions. And there are a lot of great links into that discussion that we finished off the tail end of that discussion from the previous presentation. So I'll get into some stuff about specificities within the science disciplines and sort of ideas about professional development versus other kinds, what teachers are saying about that. Sorry, just trying to, there we go. So I know that we've already had a definition of out-of-field teaching, but I wanted to highlight some of my favorite quotes that I always share. Out-of-field teaching has been called education's dirty little secret, or a misuse of teachers, which I really think that's true. Teachers are highly qualified people, and out-of-field teaching is a systemic, contextual issue, a situation that they're being placed in. So the central quote there says, an important problem because highly qualified teachers may actually become highly unqualified if they're assigned to teach subjects for which they have little training or education. It's not that they are inherently unskilled or unqualified, but it's that they're being put in a situation. So within the science specialties, as was touched on a few moments ago, there are major differences in the knowledge needed and even the pedagogical content knowledge. The different science specialties, physics, chemistry, biology, earth sciences, they come from different epistemological bases. And so these images are taken from a standardized test within Canada in the province of Alberta, and just highlighting the difference in the level of that specialized knowledge. The physics question focuses on forces and electricity in a torsion balance. And the biology question is the structures and processes within an animal cell. And these are very different areas of knowledge that teachers may not have the background in both. As we were saying before, just because they've come through the sciences, that doesn't mean that they have come through all of the sciences. In fact, that's very, very rare. So the research questions that I'm going to cover in today's presentation are, as I said, this is kind of just a starting the conversation in Canada. So I'm interested in, how do teachers begin teaching out of field? How does it happen specifically in Canada? How do they get assigned to teach out of field initially? What's the relationship between their teacher self-efficacy and teaching out of field? And what do teachers themselves feel are the most effective supports for when they are teaching out of field? So the theoretical framework that my study uses is social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory focuses on the interaction between personal factors, those are your emotions and beliefs, your behaviors that you have control and agency over, and your environment. So the interaction, reciprocal determinism happening between all three of those spheres. Social cognitive theory also provides the concept of self-efficacy, and I use teacher self-efficacy as a specified version of that concept in my study. This is an agentic approach to out-of-field teaching. So I conceptualize out-of-field teaching, as I said, as something that teachers don't necessarily choose, that kind of they get put in this particular contextual situation. And so this study, I've chosen social cognitive theory as a way to push back against the lack of agency that teachers typically have. My study puts teachers and their voices at the very center and heart of it, and considers everything through this agentic approach to giving teachers back their voice on this topic. So the study was conducted in Canada with teachers in the 4 western provinces of Canada that are highlighted on the map there. That's British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And it's a mixed methods cross-sectional design. So I used an online questionnaire and then follow-up interviews by video call. All of the participating teachers were teachers of the inclusion criteria was that they had to be teaching at least one class within grades 9 to 12 mathematics and science courses. So that's the final 4 years of high school. And the kids at those levels are approximately ages 14 to 18 in the final 4 years of high school. The participants in the questionnaire, which was the first phase, so this was circulated widely and it had 220 teacher participants. You can see on the right-hand side there the breakdown between the total populations in those 4 provinces. That's just giving you the proportions within those 4 provinces. And then the participants in this study in those 4 provinces, and you see that the breakdown is very, very similar. So despite that it is not a large-scale study with only 220 participants, it does have an approximately proportional amount of participants within each of those provinces that I'm trying to represent. The teachers who participated in the questionnaire had an average age of 42 years old and an average teaching experience, which was quite high, of 16 years. They were 55% women, and they were, as most teachers are, highly educated. 98% of them had completed a teacher education program. Due to the structure of how this works in Canada, how you go through teacher education, and particularly when you're becoming a secondary school teacher, in some provinces, you have to do an undergraduate subject-specific degree first. So 76% of the teachers had an undergraduate degree in addition to their teacher education program. In one of those provinces, Saskatchewan, there are actually programs where even to become a secondary school teacher, you can go directly into a teacher education program. And so that's what's accounting for that difference between the teachers who have an undergraduate degree first and the ones who have 98% having a teacher education program overall. A third of the teachers also have master's degrees on top of that, and then a minority, 2% of them having a doctorate degree. So on the questionnaire, the way that I measured teacher self-efficacy was I used the teacher sense of efficacy scale by Tashanin Morin and Wolf-Fulcoy. It's been widely used and previously validated in a number of contexts. It was shown to be the most commonly used instrument for quantitative studies and mixed method studies of teacher self-efficacy. So this instrument uses 24 items that load onto 3 different factors. The factors are classroom management, instructional strategies, and student engagement. And there are 8 items that load onto each one of those factors. So the teachers complete it by rating each item on a scale from 1 to 9. And that scale has 5 worded anchors that you can see there. So it goes from 1, which is nothing or not at all the way over to 9, which is they're rating that item as a great deal. I took this instrument and I made it subject specific for the scientific disciplines. So you can see in the examples at the bottom of the screen there, I took the questions and I adjusted the wording in the most minor way possible to make them specific to say either chemistry, biology, physics, mathematics, or science, where science was considered to be general science, which we teach typically up to age 16. We have a combined science in Canada. The way that I measured the extent out of field was really based back in what I was talking about with social cognitive theory as the theoretical framework for this study. So when considering teachers as being in or out of field, I wanted to give the power back to them to be able to say whether they consider themselves to be in or out of field. And because this is not, it's not a recognized idea in Canada and there aren't really conversations going on, I was aware before sending out the questionnaire that most teachers would not know the words out of field. So I had to give them a brief description of what that was and then ask them to rate themselves. So I had a carefully worded description where I was trying to not embed any sort of predisposed ideas about out of field teaching being inherently good or bad or anything like that. So I just referred to it as teaching in an area that doesn't match with one's expertise. So teachers were asked to give this rating for each of the subjects that they were teaching, similar to how they filled out the entire teacher self-efficacy instrument for each of the subject areas that they were teaching in that particular school year. And then there was also a question on the questionnaire that asked them, why did you choose that rating? And please explain to me why you selected it. For the questionnaire data analysis, in this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on a multi-level linear mixed effects model that I ran about the overall teacher self-efficacy. In this model, the fixed effects were extent out of field. So that was the previous question there, with teachers rating themselves as how far out of field they feel in each of the subjects they teach. Another fixed effect was subject, gender, and then years of subject-specific experience and total years of teaching experience. So again, for each of the subject areas that a teacher teaches, I asked them how many years they had been teaching in that subject. So if it was math or if it was chemistry, how many years have you taught this particular subject? And then I also asked, how many years have you been teaching overall? Random intercepts were used to account for the variability between teachers, which there was significant variability between teachers. And I should say the multi-level aspect of this model is that teachers are at the second level of the model because they have multiple ratings for the different subject areas that they teach. On the interview side of things, at the end of the questionnaire, I asked if anyone was interested in a follow-up interview, and I had a really overwhelming amount of interest in that, with more than half of the teachers, 113 of the 220, indicating that they were willing to have a 1-hour follow-up one-on-one interview. So that gave me lots of people to choose between, and I used purposive sampling to select a really specific pool of people, all of whom were teaching out of field. And I should say that in the questionnaire, it wasn't a necessity that they be teaching out of field because, of course, they wouldn't know that before doing the questionnaire. So that gave me, for the questionnaire, in and out of field teachers to be able to do comparison tests. Whereas on the interviews, I really wanted to focus on only interviewing people who were teaching out of field in some way, selecting as well for sort of interesting cases that I could find out of those 113 people. So I ended up interviewing 17 teachers. The interview data analysis started with an initial deductive coding where I coded everything into the topics that I was looking for. And then it was an inductive thematic analysis afterwards using a phenomenological approach where I practiced bracketing and horizontalization, so valuing all aspects of the data equally in how they're coming up. Okay, getting on to the findings. The first research question was, how do teachers begin teaching out of field? And here I developed a two-dimensional parameter space that represents teachers' responses to this in the interviews. So the vertical axis here represents whether they chose to be teaching out of field or whether they did not choose it. And the horizontal axis is showing whether they knew about that they were going to be teaching out of field before they were hired, or whether that happened or they were informed after they were hired. So up in the top right quadrant, this is sort of the ideal case for if we picture what are perhaps some positive scenarios for how out of field teaching might come up. This would be that the teacher chose it and it happened after they were hired. So they could be in a position in a particular school for a couple years and then choose to take on or to suggest or volunteer for out of field teaching. And it was really notable that while this did exist in the interviewed participants, it was the least prevalent. For both of the people who this happened for, it occurred after several years in that position. And you can see there, one of them says, I pitched astronomy because I had an interest in it. I ran an astronomy club, then I turned it into a course. So that was a really sort of positive way that they were taking on a personal interest and turning that into something that they were teaching out of field in. Physics and astronomy was not that teacher's background area. And then another teacher, rather than being directed perhaps by their own interest in a subject, was led by what the students wanted. So they say, construction was my own choice. I asked students what they wanted. They wanted woodworking, and so I said, sure. But the teacher was comfortable with taking that on and was choosing it and had been established in that school. Conversely, in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see the category there, a shift in teaching assignment post-hire. This is where teachers did not choose to take on out-of-field teaching, and they were also informed of it after being hired. I noticed that it was often quite soon after being hired, almost as if the information perhaps could have been given before they were hired but wasn't. So last minute shifts in things included in this. A teacher there says, at my second job, because I could turn the computer on, and this was an infield area for them, I was actually hired to be an information processing and career life management teacher. But by the first day, I was half information processing and half science. And science was not an area that they had taught in and didn't have a background in. And the other teacher says, my schedule had been made for a different teacher who last minute went back to another province. It already had elementary French in it. So they didn't speak French and they didn't have any background in teaching French. And yet that was on the schedule and they were told, well, sorry, somebody has to. Um, Over on the left-hand side, these two categories are difficult to disambiguate from each other because to what extent somebody is choosing it when it's the constraints of sort of systematic things is kind of unclear in some of the cases. But in the top left there, teachers who took a position that they knew involved out of field teaching. So they knew up front and they were choosing, okay, no, I'm going to take that position anyway. The teacher says, when I was moving to the school, I knew I would be taking over the math and science job. I knew that it's a small school, so I had to be open to teaching a variety of things. And some of them just felt like this was inevitable. Others felt like they didn't have very many options or they had little negotiating power. And so they were having to prioritize having a job, which is where, to what extent did they really choose it versus not choosing it, is a bit more of a continuum than these four categories show. On to the second research question here. What is the relationship between teacher self-efficacy and teaching out of field? So these are the findings from the multi-level model that I ran. And this model, you can see in the table on the left, the coefficients for each of the inputs. If they were teaching out of field slightly or farther out of field, that comes from their extent out of field rating. That was a significant predictor at the p less than 0.001 level. So very significant on that. Whereas the subject area that they were teaching in was not significant, regardless of which subject. Gender was not significant in this model, predicting their overall teacher self-efficacy. And interestingly, between the two qualifiers of years of experience, the subject specific experience is significant, whereas years of total teaching experience are not significant predictors of overall teacher self-efficacy. And I feel like this a little bit goes against maybe the general feeling that we get in schools of, if a teacher has lots of teaching experience, just in general in anything, that they might be more equipped, that their teacher self-efficacy moving into a new subject area might be fine, when actually this is showing no, it's subject specific experience that that impacts their teacher self-efficacy. And of course, the reason I'm looking at teacher self-efficacy here is because we know that teachers with high teacher self-efficacy take on more professional development and take up more, or more willing to implement changes in their pedagogical practices in the classroom. So more receptive to constructivist teaching styles and things like that. In the graph on the right-hand side there, you can see that that's the model predictors for if we held all of the other factors constant. So if we held all of the other effects constant in this model, what would be the predicted effect of just the extent out of field? And you can see that it really does predict a decrease the farther you go out of field. Research question 3 for this presentation was, what do teachers feel are the most effective supports for teaching out of field? So teachers had lots of opinions and ideas on this, but we should keep this within the context in mind of that in Canada, this isn't something that's talked about. So teachers were really on the spot. They were thinking about the things that they could picture. There aren't existing explicit supports in place. So this was, what could they think of that they felt would be the most helpful? And a lot of them identified things that they felt were the least effective. And that was really just isolated efforts and self-driven searching. So just going it on your own was felt to be the least effective. And the characteristics of the most effective supports were that those supports were collaborative, that they were concrete and curriculum aligned. That was very important to teachers because they saw that actually as a matter of efficiency. They don't have time to wade through a bunch of stuff and a bunch of sort of background knowledge to get them up to specifically where they need to be. They want to go directly to where they need to be in the curriculum knowledge for that subject. They don't want to go through, a bunch of stuff that isn't necessarily exactly what's coming up in the curriculum. And then for that support also to be sustained, so not to be sort of one-off professional development sessions. I've rated these according to how the prevalence and sort of enthusiasm with which they came up in teachers' responses on this. And number one, by blown away from the others, is mentorship and support from other teachers. But that is not to say that they want this to be informal. They were really clear about that should be including time and structures to facilitate this, sort of formalizing that idea of mentorship. So the teachers who already had that were crediting it and saying, if I didn't have this person, there's no way I would have been able to teach that. Being part of the professional learning community and having people willing to share the resources in my out-of-field subject became my favorite thing because we all work together. Okay, and people who didn't have it were recognizing that they could picture seeing this as this would have been the thing that I want. Number two was shared resources that are aligned to the curriculum. In Canada, we don't do a lot of resource sharing. And so resources, lesson planning and materials tend to be quite individualized, teacher specific. And so teachers felt like rather than having nothing, they would like to have something. They would like to have common resources shared to get them like a foot in the door and not starting from zero. And then numbers 3 and 4 did come up, but were very much beneath the other two. They were a significant step down in how teachers were valuing those or seeing those as really effective or desired supports. So that included in-service professional development. Mostly they were recognizing this quote here is really good. It would have been nice if the school had just gone forth and given me PD. Like, we're putting this out of field course on your schedule, but don't worry, we've got you planned for this PD and that PD. And there they were referring to PD that would have been really specific to that subject area they were teaching. If it was grade 12 physics, they wanted it to be right on that specific thing. So in conclusion, Canada's new to discussions around out-of-field teaching, which is one of the ways that we are quite different from our neighbors to the south there in the United States. This is a long-standing discussion with great strides being made. But in Canada, the issue is not yet being recognized or addressed. And participants were really keen to take part in this study, which I think shows that there's a definite appetite for addressing this in Canada. Regarding how teachers were initially assigned, there was a two-dimensional parameter space that I developed, looking at whether they chose to teach out of field and at what point in the hiring process that information came out. The multi-level model showed that there's a pretty strong relationship between teaching out of field and teacher self-efficacy, with teachers farther out of field having significantly lower teacher self-efficacy, and really highlighting the role of that subject-specific experience over total years of experience. And then finally, in conclusion, what supports do teachers want? They want collaborative, concrete, curriculum-aligned, sustained supports. They really value support directly from other teachers. That was the thing they felt would be the most efficient, but also the most effective, was they wanted to have people to sit down with either one-on-one or in a small group and ask their specific questions from someone who understood not only the curriculum, but the classroom realities for that course. And just to leave you with a final quote there, this came from one of the teachers in the interviews. If you're not knowledgeable or passionate about those specific outcomes or those ideas, so concepts from an out-of-field course, then you're sort of left holding a collection of puzzle pieces and you don't know where the edge is. You just start building something. So that's the sense of bewilderment that the teachers felt. Thanks so much for listening. And does anyone have questions?